In this lecture, we'll be taking a look at the nature of plate tectonics, the plates themselves, plate boundaries, and the landforms that are often the result of plate boundaries and plate interactions. Plate boundaries are classified according to their interactions with other elements in the Earth's crust. If you're to go back and take a look at the first part in our discussion of the lithosphere and its various components, you'll see some of these forces that are associated again with the rock cycle and some of the endogenic processes of the Earth itself. There are types of boundaries, and we'll be working our way through some of them in this lecture. This particular graphic will be a very important resource for you. It'll allow you to take a look at the overall geography of the plates themselves and their various boundaries and interactions, and it will also help you to be able to classify and categorize the various kinds of boundaries that we'll be looking at in this lecture and, of course, the lecture to follow. The first plate boundary type that I'd like to discuss with you today is a divergent kind of plate boundary. Divergent boundaries are generally associated with mid-oceanic ridges and to a lesser extent the development of rift valleys. Rift valleys will appear along fault systems that are closely associated geographically with divergent boundary environments. When looking at the graphic that's associated with this segment of the lecture, you can take a look at such locations as the southeastern Indian Ridge. That's an excellent example of a plate boundary environment. And again, it's an interaction between the Antarctic plate and the Indian-Australian plate. Other plate boundaries we see again in terms of this seafloor spreading associated with the western and southern Pacific Ocean rather. You can see an interaction here between the Antarctic plate and the Pacific plate with the East Pacific Ridge environment. And so these are very good examples of divergent plate boundary environments. There is no perfect plate boundary, however. And what you'll find when you start to review this particular map is that you can have combinations of plate boundaries and interactions occurring within fairly localized geographical regions. However, the two that I pointed out with regard to divergent plate boundary environments, I think are excellent examples of the kinds of landforms that we associate with this environment, which are these oceanic trenches. A second kind of boundary environment is a convergent boundary. Convergent boundaries exist between oceanic elements of the lithosphere and are marked by oceanic trenches and volcanic island arced environments. We also see convergent boundaries associated with instances geographically where we have two continental bodies colliding with one another. We find in these cases some crustal thickening and ultimately mountain building. The physical forces that are at work and are associated with this collision process make convergent boundary environments also regions geographically where we have significant seismic activities. When looking again at the tectonic plates map, specifically focusing on areas where we have convergent plate boundary environments, you can see what I mean. When you take a look at southern Asia and its interaction with the Eurasian plate, this is an area that is fairly unstable. We see a lot of earthquake activities on an annual basis in this region. This is basically a region where we have the southern Indian subcontinent welding itself to the Eurasian and Asian continents. Other regions associated with convergent boundary environments would include the northeastern segment of the Arabian Peninsula, in this case Saudi Arabia and the surrounding environment. When you look toward the top of the Pacific Ocean and specifically focus on the Aleutian Island region, the Aleutian Trench is a physical byproduct of convergence where we have, in this case, two plates interacting with one another, the North American plate and the Pacific plate. We have subduction as a process that's occurring there, and we have the development of the Aleutian Island chain. I would say a classic area for, in this case, convergent plate boundary interactions would also be occurring along the western coastal edge of what is today South America, where we have the South American plate interacting with the Nazca plate, where, again, at this Peruvian Chilean trench, the Nazca plate itself is subducting below the South American plate. This is also an area of pretty significant instability and, of course, mountain building, with the Andes being a primary example of this mountain building process. The third type or category of plate boundary and tectonic plate interaction is bound up in the concept of a transform boundary. Transform boundaries are unique. Generally, they're much smaller than the other two boundary environments, and they are marked by what are referred to as transform faults. Additionally, we see the presence geographically of fracture zone environments. These would be generally associated with granitic mountain chains where we have pretty significant breaks and fissures associated with the mountain environment. And then also we recognize transfer faults occurring geographically along mid-oceanic ridges. As is the case with convergent boundary environments, transform boundaries are very dynamic environments. They are rich in energy and generally will express this in terms of pretty significant geographic movements at times and, of course, seismic activity as well. Some of the more classic examples of this energy-rich environment is where we look geographically at slip zones, areas where we have continental bodies interacting with one another along transform boundaries and generating a ton of energy that is systematically released in a very dynamic manner in a very short period of time. When these strike-slip events occur, we will see more fissures and fracturing occurring in the surrounding landscapes. And then, of course, we also have pretty significant seismic or earthquake activities occurring as well. Transform boundary environments are a little bit harder to see on the tectonics plate map. However, if you bring your eyes to the kind of northwestern edge of the North American plate, just below, in this case, the Alaskan environment, moving along that western edge of Canada, you can see a classic transform boundary environment. In this area to the south, of course, and even along this edge as well, we have the Rocky Mountains. We have both the Canadian, of course, and the U.S. segments of the Rocky mountain chain. And then we also have a pretty significant amount of plate movement associated with this region as well. Other locations, as we move from the Near Eastern environment into the Southern Asian environment along the divide between the Arabian and the Eurasian plate environments. We also see some transform faults in that region, also the southern border of the Black Sea. And then if we bring our eyes across to, in this case, the Pacific environment, looking just to the north and to the west of the African continent, off of the in this case, western edge of what is today the Iberian Peninsula or Spain. We also see below the waterline, of course, a transform plate boundary environment. It's marking the edge between the Eurasian and African plates. Take a few moments to look over this image, reviewing again the three categories of plate boundaries, and also pay attention to the plates themselves. Look at their names, look at their locations, and try to get a sense or a feel of the plate environments and be able to recognize them. That's a very important part of this this process and part of this lecture. There is one additional comment that I want to make as you're kind of reviewing this map environment. I talked a little bit about the development of rift valley environments, again associated chiefly with geographies surrounding divergent boundary environments. If you take a look at the mid-Indian Ridge, for example, the interaction between the Indian-Australian plate and in this case the African plate, and you move your eyes just to the west of that, you'll see the development of the East African Rift environment. That's a wonderful example for the development of these rift valleys and how they will form in relation to these boundaries, and of course how they will also be a part of fault systems that are again associated with these boundary environments. So take a few minutes to review this map and just to kind of soak this information in. The next thing that we will take some time to look more closely at is the idea of plate motion and its history. This segment of the discussion will create a background to continental drift and that theoretical perspective. One of the things that I need to mention is that there are some pretty significant flaws with continental drift theory. There are also a variety of unknowns when it comes to how the plates actually move. And what I'll be sharing with you in this lecture is the kind of more generally agreed upon hypothesis for how, in this case, the plates move along that upper mantle. As you will note upon again reviewing all of these materials, at least the visual materials that I'm providing with this lecture, plates vary greatly in terms of their size. The Pacific Plate, for example, exists mostly under the Pacific Ocean, which is again one of the largest bodies of water on the planet. The Pacific Plate is much larger than many of the continental plates that surround it. Now, except where we recognize subduction to be occurring, plate shapes and boundaries generally will not match or mirror continental boundaries. This concept opposes the initial ideas that were put forward in the 19th century regarding plate tectonics. Many of these researchers wished to prove that all the continents were part of a single landmass at one time or another. Now, the single landmass concept, which I'll be talking about in just a moment, still exists. However, we have, I think, a better understanding theoretically of what that would have looked like in relation to what was initially proposed in the 19th century. Now these subduction zones, again, those that are those areas within the plate boundary environment that seem to mirror the edge of continents, these subduction zones are found generally along convergent regions east and west of the mid-oceanic ridge environment. An example, as I said before, for the Pacific would be the Pacific and the Nazca plates. It would be the western margin then of the South American continent, and it would also be an area associated with the eastern island arc environment that includes places like Japan and the Philippines. When looking at the size of plates and then what's occurring along these plate edge environments or along their borders, we realize that in this case size will have a pretty significant impact on plate motion. The larger the plate is, the more slowly that it will move on a regular basis. If, for example, we also look at something like the Mediterranean Sea and the size of the African plate, we see, with the exception of the northern boundary, a kind of plate growth. And we see that the African plate, albeit growing, is growing at a slower rate than some of the surrounding environments. As you will also note, this plate boundary environment, which again marks the southern edge of what is today the Mediterranean, is an area that's very hard to classify. There's just a ton of different kinds of very dynamic movements that are occurring in this boundary environment. However, what it is telling us though is that the motion will fluctuate between plates, and how that motion is being expressed along those plate boundaries will also fluctuate in a very dynamic manner. This means that all other plates that are bordering, in this case, the African plate, are becoming smaller, and they're becoming smaller at a much more rapid rate. It also means that there is a shift in the surface mass of the planet that is occurring in relation to this phenomenon as the plates move across the Earth's surface, ultimately interacting with the rotation of the planet and vice versa. This fact makes the nature of plate tectonics very dynamic and something that is interconnected with nearly every other earthly system that is a part of this class and a part of our general discussion. This interactive process is really what is, or what has become, the backbone for the continental drift model. And the continental drift model, which I'll share with you now, in a sense is tracking plate motion over the last 200 million years. And again, that's associated with the secular timeline, so 200 million years of, of time. Let's break down this chronology. And one of the things that you'll notice right away as you're comparing what I'm providing with you via this lecture and this graphic having to do with continental drift is that the timelines do not always match up. There's huge sections of the timeline that are either at a plus or minus kind of status. They don't necessarily give you an exact chronological date for any of this. And that's another flaw of this kind of long range, long term hypothetical testing. But let's break down this chronology together and try to make sense of it. So when you take a look, in a sense, at the upper left-hand corner of the larger image on this particular slide, you notice that most of the continental bodies are kind of clustered together into what appears to be a single landmass. So Pangaea is recognized as a name that is associated with the closest positioning of the landmasses that we recognize today, and it occurred at or around 200 million years ago. As you move your eyes from the Permian period to the Triassic period, if you move it from, in this case, left to right, you start to see, in a sense, a progressive breaking apart of certain continental bodies and a separation into a kind of a clear north and south environment, so a northern and a southern hemisphere. What this means for us is that by approximately 160 million years ago, this landmass was breaking apart. We recognize the development of an area similar to what we have today in terms of North Africa and North America, that they were more closely associated with one another. We also see the development of the Tethys Sea or Tethys Ocean. This ocean body joins a variety of other marine environments which develop this northern and southern expression to the dividing larger land mass. When you take a closer look at this, and again you move to that second frame just to the right of the first, you see that there is a body mass entitled Gondwanaland in the south. This is connecting the Indian subcontinent with all of the land masses of the southern hemisphere. And then you have the development of Laurasia, connecting all of the land masses above the Indian subcontinent. So in a sense, where the Indian subcontinent is, where southern, what becomes eventually southern Asia is a good dividing line for being able to delineate a northern and southern expression. Following this, then we move into at or around 120 million years ago, when we see the Atlantic Ocean expanding with the divergence that exists between Gondwana land itself and Laurasia, and then Gondwana land is actually beginning to break apart. We see India and Australia beginning to drift away from what becomes Antarctica. And then there is what I recognize to be kind of a larger fourth stage, which begins at or around 80 million years ago. This is where we see the separation of all of the continental land masses and, of course, the plants and animals that are part of those continental environments being isolated from one another. There are, however, faults and flood zones that begin to develop to accelerate some of this isolation process. And again, this is being actively studied by geologists today. But again, at that 80 million year period of time, we see a separation of the continents, the subcontinents, and we start to see almost a modernization of the land masses that we have today. As we approach then 65 million years ago to the present, we have what we have in the kind of lower part of the image, which is our modern expression of these land masses, and of course all of the oceanic environments that are associated with divergent and convergent plate boundary environments. So again, this is a theoretical perspective. It's a theoretical model that is currently being used to describe the interaction of plates and what this may have meant over long periods of time. But it is still in that stage of theorization, and we really, there's a lot we don't know with regard to this continental drift phenomenon. Along with this, we have a lot of outstanding questions with regard to actually how the plates themselves move. Generally, today we recognize about 3 different theoretical schools of thought regarding how the plates move with regard to the mantle and the outer core of the interior of the planet. The particular depiction that I have in this slide seems to be the one that's winning the most votes, and it's referred to as whole mantle convection. Here we see the mantle below the asthenosphere producing a circulating system of heat, which creates this kind of convection current. And the convection current is believed to be what is moving these plates. Now here we have a divergent plate example at the top of the image, but it's moving these plates away from one another and allowing for the upwelling of that magnetic material between the plates in this divergent example. If this is the best explanation, it has some very unique qualities and details that we can kind of sink our teeth into. Convection cells driving this system will radiate quite a bit of heat, and we are seeing that. In this case, the amount of heat that is believed to be moving in a convection pattern, in this circulatory pattern, toward the surface of the planet is at or around 36 trillion watts of energy. So there is enough energy to be able to drive this kind of plate movement if whole mantle convection. And then the final thing that I will say with regard to whole mantle convection is that this particular theoretical perspective would account for the changing viscosity of the Earth's mantle. And so what we understand of the mantle, what we understand of the asthenosphere, what we understand of the lithosphere and many of the endogenic processes that were described in a previous lecture, all of this seems to come together and work together in terms of the theoretical perspective underpinning whole mantle convection. In our next lecture, we will be taking a look at some of the common landforms that we associate with plate interaction. But for now, we are pretty much done with how the plates potentially are moving, the nature of the plates themselves, and the general boundary types that I shared with you at the beginning of this lecture.